Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our special Black History Month installment of our Unmasked series, History in Review. My name is Afeni Grace. I am the program coordinator for the Harvey B. Gantt Center. And for tonight's conversation, we have welcomed the perspectives of leaders in art, activism, and scholarship to reflect on how our history has framed our present and how it can advise our future. But before we get started, before we jump in, please be sure to like this video, click that thumbs up button, and also click the subscribe button below the screen to be updated on all future Gantt Center programs. Also, take the time to complete the 2-minute audience survey that is now linked in our live chat. And feel free to use that live chat for any questions or comments that you have throughout the evening. If you do have any questions for our panelists, please be sure to get those in as soon as possible so that we can answer them in the time that we do have. We will address audience questions and the survey results in the second half of the program. Now it is my honor to introduce tonight's moderator, Ms. Katrina Lewis. Katrina covers business for QCityMetro.com. She joined QCity Metro in 2018 to manage the editorial newsroom and its growing team of reporters and freelancers. In 2021, Katrina moved into her current role to dedicate more efforts towards amplifying Charlotte's Black business ecosystem. Please join me in welcoming Katrina Lewis.
Thank you, Afeni. Good evening. And joining this discussion, we have a wonderful panel this evening. So I would first like to introduce Dr. Julia Jordan-Zachary. Dr. Jordan-Zachary is a professor and chair of the Africana Studies Department at UNC Charlotte. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on African-American women and public policy. She is also the author of the award-winning book, Black Women, Cultural Images and Social Policy, and Shadow Bodies, Black Women, Ideology, Representation, and Politics, and a number of articles and edited volumes, including Black Girl Magic Beyond the Hashtag. Dr. Jordan-Zachary was awarded the Achino Teaching Award at Providence College and also serves as the president of the Association for Ethnic Studies. Good evening, Dr. Jordan-Zachary.
Good evening. Thank you for hosting me tonight.
Next, we have Christy Puckett Williams. Good evening, Christy. Christy is the statewide campaign for Smart Justice Manager for the ACLU of North Carolina and is a working scholar in mass incarceration with a focus on the treatment of women, including pregnant women in carceral facilities. Christy holds a master's in human services counseling, addiction, and recovery counseling. Having survived domestic violence, drug addiction, and long-term incarceration via community corrections, she is now an advocate and activist, fighting for the rights of all marginalized and disenfranchised people. Recently, Christy was appointed by NC's governor to serve as the chair of the Women in Incarceration Work Group for the State Reentry Council Collaborative. Also, Christy is currently traveling across the state with the Attorney General and his staff to conduct roundtables to talk about pretrial detention practices in the state. Thanks for joining us, Christy.
Thank you so much for having me.
And finally, we have Sheila Pre-Bright. Sheila is an internationally acclaimed fine art photographer known for her photographic series, 1960 Now, Young Americans, Plastic Bodies, and Suburbia. Sheila is the author of Black Lives Matter Protests, published by Chronicle Books, and 1960 Now, Photographs of Civil Rights Activists, which exhibited at the Gantt Center in 2016. She's also the recipient of several nominations and awards. Recently, she was awarded the Commission for Picturing the South by the High Museum of Art. Please welcome back Sheila Pre-Bright. Good evening, Sheila.
Good evening, and thank you.
Thank you. So like I said, looking forward to this discussion. So I want to kind of get started with you, Dr. Julia, knowing, with your expertise in Black women in public policy, talk about what role Black women historically have played in social justice movements.
So let me start off by thanking the Gantt Center and all the organizers for putting this together. I know it's never easy to pull all of this together and have it as seamless as you all have done. And it's truly an honor to be here and to walk in the footsteps of Dr. Bertha Maxwell Roddy, whom I have the pleasure of now chairing the department that she was instrumental in organizing, and Mary Harper. So I think it's important to think about these two women when we also think about the role of women in the civil rights movement and the kind of work that women do. And I want to focus a little bit on a quote by Dorothy Height. She was a founding member of the National Council of Negro Members, and this quote relates to the famous Civil Rights March. And she says, and I quote, "There was an all-consuming focus on race. We women were expected to put all our energies into it. There was a low tolerance level for questions about women's participation." And I oftentimes will tease my students and ask them about the women who showed up on the march. And oftentimes they don't remember that there was a woman sitting on the stage, the only woman sitting on the stage, who actually changed the tenor and of Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, because she was the one who was constantly yelling, "Tell him, Martin, tell him about the mountaintop," right? And that, I think, is important for thinking about women in the movement, in the multiple civil rights movements, both in the US and outside of the US, and that oftentimes we relegate women to be in service roles, secretaries, et cetera. But what we miss is a critical kind of roles that women engage in to actually shape the movement. So we talk about Martin Luther King Jr.'s stance on the Vietnam War without realizing that he actually didn't want to come out and say anything. It was Coretta Scott King that said, "Hello, can we talk about this?" Right? And so I really want us to think, and I'll kind of end here because I know about how we see women, and particularly Black women. And the fact that sometimes we don't see Black women allows us, Black women, to work in the cracks unseen, to do a lot of the movement building that's necessary for us to be able to have the Martin Luther King Jr.'s, et cetera, that we see today. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, yes. And Christy, I see you shaking your head as Dr. Julia was talking. Talk to us a little bit, because, you have the experience being on the front lines and boots on the ground, things like that. Talk to us about the experience of being a Black activist, particularly a Black woman activist. And what does that look like? How's that changed over time, from the civil rights up until now we have the Black Lives Matter currently movement?
Yeah, so I think, the experience of being Black, whether you're an activist or not, has changed for some Black folks. I think we have more representation in some spaces. We have more and better access in other spaces. But the overall feeling of not belonging, I think, is something that we still face in this country. When we watch white folks storm the Capitol and the police helped them do that, and we were tear gassed and beaten for protesting police brutality over the summer. So there are stark differences in how we are treated still today. And so I think there are lots of similarities to what we experience today to yesteryear. But there are also some differences. We do have more representation, and we do have. When I think of next week, I'll be going to the North Carolina General Assembly. In the capacity to working on policy, right? So that's what I mean by we have access to more spaces. Now, how much influence I have in that space is something that we're working and building right now. But it is a difference to see people, when I go into that building, I don't see people who look like me in that building. I don't. And so it is important for me and others like me to be in those spaces. As to the doctor's point, You know, we've been allowed to work in the shadows and build our advocacy and build our work in such a way that it looks like we popped out overnight, right? But we didn't. We're like Chinese bamboo. We've been building the network underneath the ground for 7, 8 years, so that when we do pop out, we are able to pop out and grow and seemingly have a meteoric rise. But people don't understand the deep organizing, the deep care, relationship building, the deep research that most activists and organizers put into the movement space. And so I think that's something that has always happened. And I think we have a lot to learn and glean from what has happened in the past. And we also have a responsibility to make sure that we're having a principled struggle so that folks have something to look back on when we are the ancestors, so that they can say, this is what my ancestors did. And I think we're contributing to that right now.
Most definitely. Sheila, I want to bring you into the conversation as the artist, and we're seeing the role that art is playing we're seeing it more, the role that art is playing in activism and in movements and things like that. Talk to us a little bit about your journey, about creating 1960 Now, and the ways that you've used your art to mirror what has been going on as far as movements over time.
Sorry about that. It wasn't until, thank you. And I want to thank the Gantt Center and all the organizers too for bringing us all together. For me, as an artist, photographer, it wasn't until 2013 when it was the death of Trayvon Martin. And I actually started thinking about young people, because I said the young people are the ones that's really going to make this change. And so I reached back to the elders that were in the members of the civil rights movement, but they were unknown. And I met Mr. Lonnie King, who started the Atlanta Student Movement, Dr. Rosalind Polk, who authored The Appeal of Human Rights, and Mr. Charles Black. And I have brought them into my studio to take portraits of them. But what really happened to me, I felt that I needed to go to the ground to find out what was going on myself, because as a woman and as a Black person, we are not used to, through the media, of telling our own narratives. There's always told by the white male. And so my journey started in Atlanta, from Ferguson to Baltimore to DC, and now last year, George Floyd. And what I saw in the beginning of Trayvon, I saw the emphasis of nothing but women in the LGBTQI community on the ground. They were the full force behind BLM. And when I talked to Mr. King, he said women were always important to the civil rights movement, but they didn't put them out in the forefront. They were in the back. He said without them, we couldn't continue the movement at all. And so bringing it up now, I didn't realize that I was gonna do a series on this or have a book. But I came up with the concept of 1960 Now because the young people were like, we're fighting the same fights our grandparents and parents are fighting. You know, nothing has changed. And the trauma within that through generations when it comes to Black bodies is very unsettling. And so with my journey is I felt that I had to go out there to tell our narratives.
Definitely. I want to touch on, bring it back to the conversation around policy. Christy, you mentioned it, and as a scholar, also Dr. Julia, I know you can speak to this also. So I'll start with you, Dr. Julia. There's so many layers to social justice. You know, there's the policy work, and then there's actually, you know, protests, and there's different layers. So what policies should we be advocating for when it comes to reform and building that equity for marginalized communities, knowing that, as Christy mentioned, when she goes in these spaces, you don't see many of those communities represented. What are some of those policies that we should be advocating for?
So I go back to the Combahee River Collective when we're thinking about what is it that Black women want, right?
Look, I see Christy's now.
It's because I have that in my bag every day when I think about what do I need to do, what's my guiding star. I pull that out and read it. I have it bound and everything. So that's why it just gave me life.
That is awesome. I am so happy to hear that. But I bring up the Combahee River Collective because when we're thinking about policy, I think it's important to think about policy generally, but I also think it's important to think about how policies can sometimes have different impacts depending on identities, right? And so when we're thinking about equity, we need to, I argue, we need to think about it through a lens of identities and recognize that identities can oppress people differently, and policies need to be responsive to that. And so now, having said that, what is it that Black women want? And then, some might argue, why only focus on Black women and not just all people in general? Well, here's why I talk about policy targeting Black women, because Black women are basically the canaries in the mine. And we know that when you send a canary into the mine and it fails to come out, nobody else goes in. And that's where Black women are. We are dying at rates that we've never seen before. And when I say dying, I don't mean only physical death. I also mean psychological death, spiritual death, right? And so we need policies that would allow us to live and live freely. And that stretches from access to housing. One only has to look here in Charlotte at what they refer to as tent city and see how race, class, and gender interact that leaves these individuals without homes, living on the side of the road, right? And here's what we know. We know that women, Black women, tend to secure homes for various reasons, because if you're talking about this through a heteronormative perspective, unfortunately, men, because of interactions with the criminal justice system, cannot secure homes. And so here's what's happening. Black women are experiencing higher rates of eviction than most any other group. This was happening before the pandemic. It's worsened during the pandemic. In part because Black women, we do not have wealth. We work really hard. People tend to think that Black women don't work hard, that we're lazy, et cetera. We far outpace just about any group in the labor market, right? But we're not paid. So it's not enough to think about pay equity, that we need to, women earn 70 something cents to the dollar of what men earn, but look at what Black women earn. It's even less than that. So policies need to address that, right? Policies need to look at affordable housing, access to housing. They need to look at pay equity. They need to look at health, and not just physical health, but also emotional health, spiritual health. We need access to education. We know that typically, I don't know what life's going to be like post-pandemic, but we know that a 4-year degree is a way of helping women to overcome poverty, and also the situations that sometimes lend them to have to engage in a criminal justice system. So we need to find a way that we can make a 4-year education, if they so desire, affordable. If that's not what women want, we also know that, for example, a way out of poverty is through, the construction, right? But yet women aren't trained to be in the construction industry. Well, why not? Right? So I know that's a lot. So we need a lot of policies. There's no one policy that's gonna get at us. And that's why Black women have consistently argued we are not a single issue political entity.
Got you. And Christy, I want to bring direct this to you as far as adding on to what Dr. Julie was speaking of, now bringing in the issues, the systemic issues and, power structures and white supremacy. Talk to us a little bit about that, how that influence has involved in the conversation when we talk about social justice movements.
Well, I mean, systems of oppression are always recalibrating to maintain the power. And so the retaliation that we may experience or that we have experienced, so for example, like getting arrested, and as a collateral consequence of getting arrested, you lose your job and you lose your housing. Those risks have always existed. Those things for Black folks have always been in jeopardy. And so, I mean, they will always exist in a system of white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. We see those things reflected in the movement as well. I mean, we see folks undermining the leadership of women often, white folks who can't follow Black leadership or questioning Black leaders all the time in a way in which they don't investigate or interrogate white-led organizations, putting Black folks and Black organizations under a microscope in a way in which they don't do, say, like the Red Cross, or let's even say the ACLU. Hell, let's just be real, right? But we will interrogate and investigate a small nonprofit, honey, and want to see their 990s, and they want all the I's dotted and the T's crossed. But a large organization that is white-led and has not really advanced and not put itself out of business, has always maintained its place in our society, there's no real investigation of that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think those things have always existed, and we've all been steeped in white supremacy. We've all been indoctrinated in its ideologies. And so we're always going to have to be constantly assessing our how we show up. So I'm constantly assessing, am I policing people? Like my saying is like, I have to kill the cop in my own head. Like when I worry about other people, I have to remember that my ancestors, y'all know my dad was white. So my ancestors in South Carolina, my dad's from South Carolina, in 1690, they were authorized and required to question Black people, where you're going, who you with, where you're from. Like it was codified through policy that white people were deputized to show up in this way. And so when people do that today, when I do that today, I have to remind myself that that is a feature of white supremacy that has been passed down to me, that I feel like I have the right to know where someone is going, what they're doing, and all of that. And so, again, we've all been steeped in it, but it's also all of our responsibilities to decolonize and to decompress and divest from that responsibility. You know, white supremacy, if we just haven't thought about it for real, it's a lot. It takes a lot of energy. I mean, you got to always be worried about other people. You got to always be assessing what they doing, who they with, what they from, what they got. You always got to be strategizing and trying to get ahead. I mean, it is exhausting. And to exist up under white supremacy is just as exhausting, because as Black people, not only do we have to exist up under white supremacy, we're constantly navigating the various systems of oppression. And so when I think of, you know, how does a pattern show up? I recognize, number one, that it is a pattern, and it helps me to cope with it. So when someone shows up problematic or in a way that doesn't align with my values, I have to remind myself that, you know, liberation and freedom is a journey. It is not a destination that we will get to, right? Like we will always be on the journey towards agency, autonomy, liberation, and freedom. And there are people who are going to be a little bit further behind. And my job is to stay laser focused on, you know, me and my community getting to that liberation that we're looking for. And to not get sidetracked, to understand that the movement also gets sidetracked on purpose by the systems of oppression. Like if we think about how do you break a movement, you send a group in that just causes dissension and destruction everywhere, tell a couple lies here and there, and boom, the movement can be, you know, sidetracked in a city in that way. And so I think, you know, the tools of the past are the same tools that are being used today. It is on us to learn from the past of the things that have happened, and take what we can, the parts that we can use, and move and keep moving.
Thank you. Sheila, so in what ways, let's talk about the intersection of politics and art and culture, Black culture. What have some of those patterns look like over time?
I think the patterns are the same, but in contemporary times is different in that respect. We have the technology of Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, where a lot of that information and activism is spread that way globally. Like, for example, when the situation happened with George Floyd, people globally was something different about this one, because Black bodies have always been, well, since 2013 that I know of, but been happening past then, is that technology is driving that too. And these institutions that we've been dealing with since the beginning of time, if you do not pull it up by the root, it will grow back. And with the young people, they're not looking at these institutions like that. They're carving their own way when it comes to political and even into the arts. Because if you can't imagine, you cannot advance at all. It's like Kimberly Drew, she has a book out now called Black Futures, and they're looking at reimagining of the way that we should go. And what I'm trying to say is W.E. Du Bois talked about how all art is propaganda, and it blurs the line. He uses his writing for that. Think about the hip hop culture, well, the Black Panthers, and what came out of the Black Panthers, the hip hop culture in the 90s, when they talked about the urban culture, and they did it through the music. Beyonce, what did she do? Her symbolism at the Super Bowl was the Black Panthers. She's doing that through her music, okay? Look at Kendrick Lamar, his album that came out about Be Humble. So I think in contemporary times right now, when it comes to politics, the arts, it's all together. It is really all together.
Thank you. So I believe now we will have Afeni. Turn it over to Afeni. There you go.
Thank you, Katrina. Yes, so we're going to pivot for just a brief moment and discuss the results of the audience survey. So the first question in the survey is, what do you believe to be the greatest contributing factor to Black culture and the Black American experience? As you can see here, we have a 36% majority of surveyors who selected that it's social structures. About 28% selected social, economic, and financial structures. We have 20% of surveyors who selected education. And we have a way smaller percentage of surveyors who selected art and entertainment, and also at 4%, and then also politics at 4%. Our second question was, how has Black art influenced the way you identify as Black and or American? And this question was open-ended, so it wasn't multiple choice. People could kind of put in their own answers. And some people gave responses such as, seeing images and hearing the drumbeat of African music makes me proud and feeds my soul. Someone else said it basically influenced my outlook of the world, my culture, and my vision for my future. And someone else said it made me feel like I was not alone, and it brought such beauty to my Blackness. So our third question, which was a multiple choice question, was, looking forward, what should be the Black community's main focus to further enrich and evolve our culture? And we have about 44% of surveyors who selected that it is the healing of generational traumas. About 30% of surveyors selected that it's the extensive understanding of the layered historical and current injustices to Black people. 13% selected the greater emphasis on education and scholarship, and we have about 4% of surveyors who selected that about 8% who selected that they're not sure, 4% who said a deeper cultivation of Black businesses and financial institutions. And so our final question, which was also an open-ended question, it asks, what 3 words would you use to describe Black history and why? And there's many responses here. I'll just read a few. So one surveyor said that it is resilient, vibrant, and complex. Someone else said that it is provoking, pivotal, and progressive. Another surveyor said that it is necessary, it is critical, and it is shunned. And someone else said that it is spirit, culture, and legacy. So Katrina, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Based on these survey responses, was there something that stood out to you or to the panelists?
I think I want to talk about the looking forward question. So I believe that was question 3, and how, almost half of the responses talked about healing generational traumas. And that's something that that conversation has come to the forefront a lot more, as now we have folks acknowledging, and putting out statements and things like that. And so I want to ask each of you your thoughts in terms of seeing surveyors' responses about what the main focus, what they think the main focus of the Black community should be. Do you agree, as far as, a lot of attention should be on the healing of generational traumas, followed by paying attention to that layering, as we talked about with social justice? And I'll start with Sheila.
That's number one. The reason why I said that, when I was on the ground, I saw the pain, I saw the hurt, especially with the young people, because they couldn't understand it. They felt that we have come far, but this is like a setback. And that generational trauma is very, very important, because within Black culture, we've never talked about mental illness. I was always told to suck it up, move on, and that's what gave us strength. Henry Louis Gates just did the documentary and book about the Black churches, and the Black churches was everything to Black culture. And I really, in that, the music is the one that helped them, kept going when they were out there on the ground. And trauma, for me, and I think for our culture, is number one. And like I said before, if we cannot imagine the future, we cannot advance at all.
Mm-hmm. Christy, what were your thoughts?
I agree that, an important part of being able to continue fighting is to heal. And the only way I've been able to show up in a powerful way is through my own healing. And so I was only able to derive real power when I understood my pain and my trauma, and understood how to wield that pain and trauma in meaningful ways, because there were destructive ways in which I had wielded that pain and that trauma, but there were constructive ways. And so I needed to be taught those ways. And part of that education came through my own, graduate studies and figuring out my role in this work. I came into the work as a healer, as someone who was working with folks to heal their own issues, as I was had worked to learn to heal some of mine, having an addiction, being addicted to crack cocaine, and being a victim of the war on drugs, and a victim of this system of mass incarceration. It was important for me to work with people who struggle with the same things that I struggle with, because what I felt like oftentimes was there was no one in that room who understood me. because there was no one in that room. There were people in that room who were in positions of power over me, but none of them had the experiences that I had. So I had judges and DAs and police officers and counselors and folks who were there to support me, who had no baseline foundational understanding of the way that my addiction, my trauma, and the incarceration that they prescribed for me was exacerbating all of the things that I came into the system with, right? And so the incarceration just heightened the trauma that I was already experiencing, and heightened the violence that I was already experiencing, and heightened the homelessness and the danger and the terror. Like all of those things were exacerbated, but the people who were in charge had no understanding of that. And it was because I had no understanding of it. I wasn't able to articulate those things because I was still very much down in the trauma every day. And so I think it will be very freeing for folks. I'm really glad that people are prioritizing that, because what we often do is center whiteness. And a way for us to stop centering whiteness is to center Blackness. And we center Blackness when we center on healing ourselves and our communities and our families, and showing up and being present, even in a world that is hard and cruel and inhumane, but we're still able to show up and be present and glean some type of joy. I didn't say fun, I said joy. And so how do we glean joy from these, in these moments? That's through the healing that we have to experience in order to be able to feel that joy.
Great. Right now, I want to take a couple of questions from viewers. So this is for any of you to answer. But one question we have says, what do you think makes Black history and the Black experience the most unique? What are your thoughts, Dr. Julia?
What makes Black history and Black, I'm sorry, what? The most unique?
And the Black experience the most unique?
Well, some would argue that the institution of slavery is part of the foundation of what makes the Black experience particularly unique, because modern slavery, let me put it that way, what we consider the Atlantic slave trade, that slavery that came through the Atlantic triad, because no other group has ever experienced enslavement in that way. We know that slavery existed prior to that, right? But it never existed in the way that it did in modern times. So I would argue that it has to be our experience across nations with the institution of slavery, and layered on that with the experience of colonialism. Oftentimes people speak about slavery, the institution of slavery, and forget colonialism, and what I also now call neo-colonialism. So for example, when we're talking about imagining a future, if you go into many African countries, you're going to find China. The Chinese are following what, for me, and I'll say this, I used to want to be an economist, so I look at this from an economic perspective, and I have a master's in economics, don't ask. And I look at this from an economic perspective, and how they are literally tracing the economic footprint left by the institution of slavery and colonialism. They're also in Jamaica, and they're going into the Caribbean, and people are being silent about this, right? Because the way that it's being done, it's to me very insidious. And my fear, because, to kind of come back to that earlier question about imagining a future, is that if we're not careful, we're going to be in this cycle of being, for lack of a better term, owned in a way that other countries other peoples aren't being owned.
Sheila, do you have anything to add, or Christy to add to that question about what makes the Black experience the most unique?
I think because we have constantly been put in the box, and within that box, we are told that we need to be like the other. And I think we are so different, and it's within us, and that we can't be nothing but what's within us, even though, like Dr. Julia was talking about, if we reimagine, we might get, did you say loss or own? Did you say own? Own? I think that we're still on now, because we always looking up to these institutions to try to help. And I know it's so hard, but for me to be around the younger people and see what they're doing and how they're moving, and we're all going to be owned because there's the powers to be, is that they don't care about these institutions at all. They're trying to make their own. And that's why Kimberly Drew is talking about Black futures, because we can't depend on that anymore.
That leads into another viewer question that says, how do you think we can best change minds to stamp out generations of racism and white supremacy? Should we change one mind at a time, or at the community level, the masses?
I mean, I think it's both, and I think we have to do both at the same time. You know, I think we have to get real comfortable with changing our own mind, right? You know, oftentimes we like to start with other people when we really just need to start at home and get real clear about what Blackness is to us and how we show up and how we're working to decolonize, right? I mean, I think we do have to have you know, education in our communities as well. And there was something else that you said. What's the second part of the question, Katrina? I'm sorry.
Should we change one mind at a time, or at the community level of the masses?
Yeah, I think we have to do both. We have to start you know, with ourselves, but then and be what I teach. The pedagogy that I use is the popular education model, which is we're all teachers and we're all learners, right? So we all have something to offer in this space. And so if we have a diverse space, if we have diverse thought, I really believe that we can get there. But what we have to do, commit to doing first, is telling the truth. I think the biggest threat to white supremacy is critical thinking. What we see is a lack of critical thought. People just don't investigate. They rely on a media source or some source to tell them what to think, feel, and believe. And they never develop that muscle of thinking, feeling, and believing in their reality. And that's why we see the cognitive dissonance of folks who live in really poor areas, poor white people, who continuously vote against their own best interests. And it's because they've been fed you know, an ideology that their plight in life is the result of Black and Latinx and immigrant communities taking over and making America bad, right? But they didn't critically think about that, right? If they had just sat and thought for 10 minutes, look at the Capitol insurrection. If they had just thought for like 10 minutes about, why am I running up in here? What is this end result going to be? Does this tactic advance the strategy? Like all of that, they probably wouldn't have went, right? And so what we have to do as a community is commit to thinking critically and investigating. Even what I say, don't take what I say just because I'm sitting here on this panel at face value. Take what I say and investigate it and mull it over in your head and see if it aligns or if it matches up with your experience. And if so, then that's I'm somebody that you can potentially build with and build community and relationship with. If I am someone who, if what I say does not turn out to be in alignment with where you are, then your commitment has to be to find your group that is and work towards those things. I think that's what we have to be doing, is committed to understanding that Blackness is not a monolith, that various people have various experiences of Blackness, and that we have to be open that what we've been taught about Blackness has been through the lens of whiteness. And until we get rid of that lens of whiteness, we will never have the full understanding of what Blackness can be.
That's, Dr. Julia, yeah, go ahead.
No, I heard that question and I had to pull up this quote, and I thought of two people. I thought of Martin Luther King Jr., and I always encourage individuals to read Letter from Birmingham Jail if you want to know how you go about convincing people and whether or not you should, because that letter is a real indictment about consciousness raising, but also Audre Lorde, right? And permit me to read this a little bit. She says, I am responsible for educating teachers who dismiss my children's culture in school. Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men. Lesbians and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual world. And she goes on to say, the oppressors maintain their position, excuse me, the oppressors maintain their position and evade responsibility for their own actions. As a result, there is a constant drain of energy, which might be better used in redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future. I'll just use Ms. Lorde's words and leave it there.
Yes, I see everyone shaking your head, and it segues into another viewer question that said, what are specific ways discrimination and inequity influenced our expression and identification with being Black? Anybody want to take that?
Repeat that again.
It says, what are specific ways discrimination and inequity influenced our expression of and identification with being Black?
So I don't know why literary people keep coming to me, but I think about Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. I think about Native Son by what's his name? I can't think of his name right now. Their Eyes Are Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. I mean, these are all really good cultural understandings of how sometimes, to borrow from W.E.B. Du Bois, there's this veil, right? And that oftentimes the understanding of Blackness is projected back onto us, whether it's through cultural productions, political productions, policy productions. And part of the struggle around being Black is to learn how to resist that. So when we were talking about, generational trauma, I am always a little cautious about that. Not that I don't support it wholeheartedly, but sometimes it becomes very individual and people forget that sometimes we're also responding to structures. So I had a conversation recently with a friend of mine. I'm from Barbados and she's from and we were talking about how, for example, little Black children can be held so tightly. And she doesn't have children. And she said, I don't understand, you see a little white kid running and the Black kid, the mother's like, come up onto me, don't move from under me, and we were talking in Bajan dialect, right? And I said to her, it's because that Black mother, even though Barbados is 90% Black, knows that if that child wanders too far, there are consequences, right? There are consequences for being Black. We saw that with Trayvon Martin, for example. And this is how this stuff influences how we engage with our identity, right? So we're constantly, even though we might not always be aware of it, because like I said, in Barbados, we're 90% Black. Why is that mother still holding that child so tightly? Right? There's no plantation owner to snatch that child up. But that's been passed on through the years, that the way that we protect our children is to keep them close, because our children don't have innocence, right? It's the one thing. And typically in the US and in most countries, children are given innocence. We assume that children are always innocent unless you're Black. And as long as you're Black, regardless of age, you are a threat. And I don't care where you kind of sort of go in this world, we protect our children like that. And it comes out of how people are seeing Blackness and how we respond to that. Mm-hmm. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. This question is centers around art. So someone asked, how has the subject matter of Black art changed over time and stayed the same?
I don't look at it as Black art. I look at it as Black art, not as Black art, but as art, but it comes from our experiences. And I think, I'll give you an example that what happened to me. I did a body of work called Suburbia, in which I wanted to point my camera to African Americans instead of the urban culture, because those are the imagery of urban culture is the imagery that we always being projected on. And if I could say it like this, it's like negative stereotypes. So when I did this body of work and I called it Suburbia, and I won this national award for it, and I had publishers, curators, editors, and all of them looking at the work, one thing that they told me all of them had in common, I did not have enough signifiers in that work to show that these were Black homes. So it's not about the art changing, it's the ideology of people and how they think, because unconsciously I asked them what they wanted to see, fried chicken, collard greens, and and they couldn't say anything. And they says, well, we never heard of your suburbia. Why didn't you call it Black suburbia? So I think as an artist, those concepts and their ideologies is constantly projected on us, because all we're doing is giving you our experience as a human, and we happen to be Black.
Perfect way to put it. As one final question, as we wrap up, and this is for each of you, what would be your 3 words for Black history and why? And Sheila, since you already were in the flow of conversation.
Repeat that again.
What would be your 3 words for Black history and why? There's no right or wrong answers. These are your words. When you think about Black history, what 3 words come to you?
3 words.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good one. I'm gonna say this again. Reimagining Black futures.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Dr. Julia?
Questioning, joy, and freedom.
Christy, did she take your words?
So yeah, I was going to say joy, but I can say liberation, joy, and belonging. I think it's more of a future hope.
Mm-hmm.
Not
right.
Yes. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. I appreciate all of you, and as well as our viewers, appreciate your input to the conversation, and definitely again want to acknowledge the Gantt Center for hosting us in this space to have the conversation. As far as, are there any final words that you all want to share that adds to this conversation or to the work that you all are doing in terms of we have the audience, and as we talk about Black history and how it ties into the work you're doing, is there anything that we didn't that I didn't ask that you want to leave the viewers with? Sheila?
I could say one thing. I feel that as an image maker and how the technology is now, we all have the opportunity to tell our stories, change our narratives. And I think that's very, very good. We don't need the institutions. I'm not bad on institutions. What I'm trying to say is we have platforms now where we don't have to wait for that. And there's a lot of young people. It's amazing what they're doing and changing that narrative.
Yes, Dr. Julia?
I think what I would say is that it's great to imagine a future, but don't forget the past.
Right.
And be careful about using the past as a monument, but use it as a tool for engagement and understanding and consciousness raising.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Dr. Julia. Definitely hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Christy, any final words, any last words from you?
Just the words that I often leave with folks is to remember that the collective is more powerful than the elected. The collective is more powerful than the elected. So we as a people, we the people have the power, and we have to wield that power in ways that meets the needs of all people, but especially Black, trans, queer family members, because once they're taken care of, that means all of us have a place in society and are taken care of.
Thank you. So once again, thank you for joining us. And as we say good night to you all, again, just appreciate your expertise and your perspectives that you brought to the conversation. So again, round of applause. Thank you very much, Dr. Julia. Have a good night. Christy Puckett Williams, thank you again. Sheila Pre-Bright, thank you for joining us.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yes, good night. So again, this type of programming, this is the latest in the Gantt Center's Unmasked series, where we do have these conversations that are important to the Black community. So again, I appreciate the Gantt Center for inviting us and having me to moderate the conversation, and I will turn it back over to Afeni.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Thank you for sharing your final words, and thank you so much for leading tonight's discussion. The Gantt Center celebrates Black history every day, from our virtual programming, our initiatives, to our featured exhibits. We understand the importance of celebrating the boundless contributions of Black people, and we could not do this type of work without your support. Our Text to Give donation platform is another way you can support our mission. By texting Unmasked to 345-345, you conveniently assist the Gantt Center in cultivating and expanding our reach. We are constantly encouraged and constantly in deep gratitude for everyone's support. And we thank you all especially for joining us tonight. And be sure to visit our website, ganttcenter.org, to learn more about our current exhibits and upcoming experiences. Until next time, as always, please be safe and take care. Good night.